150 Apache warriors don't ride through a thunderstorm just to have a conversation. They come for one of three things: revenge, justice, or total annihilation. And Ezekiel Iron Morrison was about to discover which category his actions had placed him in. But to understand why the most feared war chief in Arizona Territory was now sitting on his horse just outside Morrison's property line, we need to go back exactly 48 hours to a moment that would either make Iron Morrison a legend or ensure he never saw another sunrise. The Arizona desert was trying to kill everything in it, as it had been doing for thousands of years. It was late summer of 1881, and the heat was the kind that made men question their life choices. Iron Morrison had been questioning his for the better part of 3 years now, ever since he'd decided to build a homestead in what everyone back east called God-forsaken Apache country. At 29, Iron was already carrying more scars than most men twice his age, souvenirs from his time fighting in the cavalry before he'd gotten tired of taking orders and decided to carve out his own piece of the frontier. His ranch sat in a valley that most folks avoided, nestled between red rock formations that looked like ancient monuments to some forgotten civilization. The locals in Prescott had warned him about settling there. Too close to the reservation, they'd said. Too far from help when trouble comes calling. But Iron had always been the type to see opportunity where others saw danger. And this particular piece of land had something that made all the risks worthwhile: a natural spring that never ran dry, even in the worst drought years. On this particular morning, as Iron worked on expanding his barn, something caught his attention that made his blood run cold. Movement on the eastern ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun. But this wasn't the easy loping gait of wild horses or the scattered movement of deer. This was purposeful, controlled, and heading directly toward his ranch. As the figure got closer, Iron could make out details that didn't make sense. It was a young Apache boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, but he was moving wrong. Stumbling, falling, getting up and stumbling again. And he was alone, which in Apache country meant one of two things. Either he was lost, or he was running from something that was worse than being lost. Iron set down his hammer and walked slowly toward the approaching figure, his hand instinctively checking the position of his Colt 45, not because he intended to use it on a child, but because in this part of Arizona a lone Apache boy often meant there were Apache warriors somewhere nearby, and they might not be in a talking mood. As he got closer, Iron could see that something was seriously wrong. The boy's traditional Apache clothing was torn and blood-stained. His face was swollen on one side, and he was favoring his left leg with each step. But it was the boy's eyes that hit Iron like a punch to the gut. They held the same look Iron had seen in the eyes of wounded soldiers during the war. The look of someone who had seen too much, too young. The boy spotted Iron and froze, clearly trying to decide whether to run or collapse. Iron raised his hands slowly, palms visible, and spoke in the few Apache words he'd picked up from trading with peaceful bands: friend, water, help. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the boy from bolting. What Iron didn't know was that this wasn't just any Apache child. The torn clothing the boy wore wasn't just traditional garments. They were ceremonial pieces that only the immediate family of a war chief would possess. The silver medallion hanging around the boy's neck, partially hidden beneath his torn shirt, bore the distinctive markings of Chief Victorio Crowfeather, the most powerful and feared Apache leader in the territory. But Iron Morrison wasn't thinking about politics or tribal hierarchies as he approached the injured child. He was thinking about the time 3 years earlier when he'd found his own younger brother dying after an Indian raid on their family's farm in Kansas. He'd been too late then, arriving just in time to hold his brother as life faded from his eyes. He wasn't going to be too late again. The boy collapsed just as Iron reached him, and up close the damage was even worse than it had appeared from a distance. Along with the obvious injuries, the swollen face, the favored leg, the cuts and bruises, Iron could see the telltale signs of severe dehydration and hunger. The kid probably hadn't eaten in days. Iron scooped the boy up in his arms, surprised by how light he was, and carried him toward the ranch house. As he walked, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten with worry. Tracks in the dirt near where the boy had collapsed. Unshod horse hooves heading west. Recent tracks, probably no more than a few hours old. Someone had been chasing this kid, and they might still be out there. Inside his modest cabin, Iron laid the boy on his own bed and began assessing the injuries. The swelling on the face suggested a serious blow, possibly from a rifle butt or a boot. The leg wasn't broken, but it was badly bruised and might have been twisted in a fall. The cuts looked like they'd come from thorns or sharp rocks, consistent with someone who'd been running through rough country without watching where they were going. But it was when Iron began cleaning the boy's wounds that he noticed something that made his hands shake. Around the child's wrists were marks that could only have come from rope burns. Someone had tied this kid up, and recently, as Iron worked, the boy drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling words in Apache that Iron couldn't understand. But during one of his more lucid moments, the boy grabbed Iron's wrist with surprising strength and spoke a single word in English: "Soldiers." Iron's blood turned to ice. Soldiers. This kid had been captured by soldiers and somehow he'd escaped. But why would U.S. cavalry troops be holding an Apache child prisoner? And more importantly, what would they do to get him back? The answer to that question was riding hard across the desert at that very moment, led by Captain Marcus Weatherby of the 6th Cavalry. Weatherby was the kind of officer who believed that the only good Indian was a dead Indian, and he'd been using the captured Apache boy as bait to draw out Crowfeather's war party. When he discovered that morning that his prisoner had somehow slipped his bonds and disappeared into the night, Weatherby had flown into a rage that his subordinates had learned to fear. "Find that little savage," Weatherby had ordered his men. "I don't care if you have to turn over every rock in Arizona. We're going to use him to end Crowfeather once and for all." But what neither Weatherby nor Iron Morrison knew was that Chief Victorio Crowfeather had already discovered his son's disappearance and was leading the largest war party assembled in Arizona territory in over a decade toward the last known location of the cavalry unit. 150 of the finest Apache warriors painted for war and carrying enough weapons to level a small town. Back at the ranch, Iron had managed to get some water and broth into the boy, and the kid was finally sleeping peacefully. As Iron sat beside the bed keeping watch, he noticed something he'd missed before. Beneath the grime and blood, the boy's facial features were refined, aristocratic even. This wasn't just some random Apache child. This was someone important. Iron's suspicions were confirmed when he took a closer look at the silver medallion around the boy's neck. He'd seen similar pieces before during his cavalry days, usually around the necks of Apache war chiefs during the rare peace negotiations. If his memory served him correctly, this particular design belonged to the most dangerous Apache leader in the territory. "Jesus," Iron whispered to himself. "What have I gotten myself into?" As if in answer to his question, a sound drifted across the desert that made every hair on Iron's body stand on end. War drums, distant but getting closer, carried on the evening wind like a promise of violence. Iron had heard those drums before, during his cavalry days, and he knew what they meant. Somewhere out there in the gathering darkness, Apache warriors were working themselves up for battle. Iron moved to his window and peered out across the desert. At first he saw nothing but the usual landscape of scrub brush and red rock. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the fading light, he began to make out shapes that didn't belong. Riders on the horizon, moving in a coordinated pattern that spoke of military precision and deadly intent. The boy stirred on the bed behind him, apparently awakened by the sound of the drums. He sat up slowly, his eyes immediately finding Iron's face, and for the first time since he'd arrived, the kid smiled. Not a big smile, just a small upturn of the lips. But it was enough to tell Iron that the boy understood he was safe, at least for now. The child spoke softly in Apache, gesturing toward the window where the drum sounds were coming from. Then he switched to broken English. "My father comes. Many warriors. You good man. But," he paused, searching for the words, "they not know you good man." Iron nodded grimly. The boy was trying to warn him. His father was coming with a war party, and they wouldn't stop to ask questions before they started shooting. In Apache culture, anyone who had contact with a missing child was potentially a threat to be eliminated. How many warriors? Iron asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The boy held up both hands, opening and closing his fingers repeatedly. Iron counted along 10, 20, 30. The kid kept going until he'd counted to 150. Iron's legs went weak. 150 Apache warriors. That wasn't a rescue party, that was an army. And they were all coming for one simple homesteader who'd made the mistake of showing kindness to a lost child. But as Iron looked at the boy, seeing the trust in those young eyes, he realized something that surprised him. He wasn't sorry he'd helped. Even knowing what was coming, even understanding that he might not live through the night, he couldn't bring himself to regret saving this kid's life. The drums were getting louder now, and Iron could begin to make out individual beats in the rhythm. This wasn't the chaotic noise of an unorganized raid. This was a formal war dance, the kind that Apache warriors performed before major battles. They were preparing themselves mentally and spiritually for what they expected to be a significant fight. Iron began making preparations of his own. He checked his weapons, the Colt 45 on his hip, the Winchester rifle mounted above the fireplace, and the double-barreled shotgun he kept by the door. Enough firepower to take a few warriors with him, but nowhere near enough to hold off 150. As he loaded his weapons, Iron found himself thinking about his life and the choices that had led him to this moment. He could have stayed back east, found a safe job in a city, married some local girl, and raised a family in comfort and security. Instead, he'd chosen the frontier, chosen the risks and the dangers and the constant possibility of violent death. But looking at the Apache boy who was now sitting up in bed and watching Iron's preparations with solemn eyes, Iron realized that some choices were worth the consequences. Sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting that you might not live to see the results. The boy spoke up again, his English coming easier now. "You save me from soldiers. Bad soldiers hurt me, tie me up. You give water, food, safe place." He paused, touching the medallion around his neck. "My father is great chief. He will want to thank you. But other warriors, they maybe think you take me, hurt me. They see white man with chief's son. They think bad things." Iron nodded. The kid was smart, mature beyond his years. He understood the political complexities of the situation as well as any adult. "What's your name, son?" "I am called Swift Arrow," the boy replied, "son of Victorio Crowfeather, war chief of the Chiricahua Apache." Iron whistled low. Crowfeather wasn't just any war chief. He was the war chief, the one who'd been leading the resistance against American expansion for over a decade. If this boy was really his son, then Iron wasn't just harboring any Apache child. He was protecting the future leader of one of the most powerful tribes in the Southwest. "Well, Swift Arrow," Iron said, trying to keep his voice steady, "looks like your father is about to test whether I'm worthy of protecting his son." The drums stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. Iron moved back to the window and looked out across his property. What he saw there made his mouth go dry with fear. They came out of the desert like spirits materializing from the earth itself. Apache warriors on horseback, their bodies painted with symbols of war, their weapons gleaming in the last rays of sunlight. They moved in perfect formation, spreading out to surround Iron's ranch with military precision that would have impressed any cavalry officer. At the head of this army rode a man who could only be Victorio Crowfeather himself. Even at a distance, Iron could see the authority in the way he sat his horse, the way the other warriors positioned themselves relative to his presence. This was a leader who commanded absolute respect and absolute obedience. Chief Crowfeather raised his hand, and the entire war party came to a halt just outside the range of Iron's weapons. They sat motionless on their horses, 150 pairs of eyes focused on the small cabin where Iron Morrison stood with their chief's son. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Iron could feel sweat running down his back despite the evening coolness. This was the moment of truth. Everything that happened next would depend on choices made in the next few seconds. Swift Arrow stood up from the bed, moving carefully on his injured leg. "I must go to them," he said. "They need to see I am safe, unharmed." Iron nodded. "Are you strong enough to walk?" "I am son of Crowfeather," the boy replied with quiet dignity. "I am strong enough." Together, they moved toward the cabin door. Iron's hand rested on his gun, not because he intended to use it, but because some situations demanded that a man face death armed. Swift Arrow noticed the gesture and spoke quietly. "You are a brave man, Iron Morrison. My father will see this." Iron paused, surprised. "How do you know my name?" Swift Arrow smiled slightly. "Apache know all who live in our territory. We know you fought with cavalry, but you fight with honor. We know you live alone, harm no one, take only what you need. This is why my father will listen before he decides your fate." That was somewhat reassuring, but as Iron opened the cabin door and stepped out into the evening air facing 150 armed warriors, he couldn't help but think that listening before deciding his fate wasn't exactly a guarantee of survival. Chief Crowfeather dismounted from his horse with fluid grace and walked forward until he was close enough for conversation but far enough away to avoid any appearance of immediate threat. Up close, Iron could see that the Apache leader was a man in his 40s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors and the scars of someone who'd survived more battles than most men ever fought. When Crowfeather spoke, his English was precise and formal, the words of a man who'd learned the language through necessity rather than choice. "I am Victorio Crowfeather, war chief of the Chiricahua Apache. You have something that belongs to me." Iron took a deep breath. "Chief Crowfeather, I am Ezekiel Morrison. Your son came to my ranch injured and hungry. I gave him food and shelter, nothing more." Crowfeather's eyes flicked to Swift Arrow, taking in every detail of the boy's condition. The clean bandages Iron had applied, the fact that the boy was standing upright and alert, the way Swift Arrow looked at Iron without fear or hatred. "My son was taken by soldiers 3 days ago," Crowfeather said. "They planned to use him as bait to draw me into an ambush. How did he come to be in your care?" Swift Arrow stepped forward and began speaking rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward Iron and then toward himself. Iron couldn't understand the words, but he could see the effect they were having on the assembled warriors. Angry murmurs began rippling through the crowd, but the anger seemed to be directed not at Iron but at someone else entirely. When Swift Arrow finished speaking, Crowfeather's expression had changed subtly. The cold calculation was still there, but it was now mixed with something that might have been respect. "My son tells me that you found him after he escaped from the soldiers. He tells me that you could have turned him away, could have feared for your own safety, but instead you brought him into your home and cared for his injuries." Crowfeather paused, studying Iron's face. "He also tells me that you did this knowing who he was, knowing what the consequences might be." Iron nodded. "I saw the medallion. I knew he was someone important, but he was also a hurt kid who needed help." For the first time, Crowfeather's stern expression softened slightly. "In my culture, the measure of a man is not how he treats his equals, but how he treats those who cannot defend themselves. You have shown honor toward my son when you could have shown fear." Iron felt a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly dampened when Crowfeather continued. "However, there are those among my warriors who believe that any white man who has contact with an Apache child must be viewed with suspicion. They believe that you may have been working with the soldiers, that this rescue might be part of a larger trap." As if summoned by these words, another Apache warrior rode forward from the main group. This man was younger than Crowfeather, maybe in his 30s, with facial scars that spoke of many battles and eyes that burned with barely controlled fury. When he spoke, his voice carried the edge of someone looking for a fight. "I am Red Wolf, war leader of the southern bands. I say this white man lies. How do we know he did not help the soldiers take Swift Arrow? How do we know this is not another trick?" Swift Arrow immediately began protesting in Apache, but Red Wolf cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You are young, nephew. You do not see the deception that your elders can see. This man could have been told to rescue you to gain our trust." Iron could see the dangerous dynamic developing. Crowfeather might be willing to believe in Iron's innocence, but he was also a leader who couldn't ignore the concerns of his war leaders without risking his own authority. And Red Wolf clearly wanted blood. "What would convince you of my intentions?" Iron asked, addressing both chiefs but focusing on Red Wolf, who seemed to be the bigger threat. Red Wolf smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. "There is an old Apache custom for situations like this. Trial by combat. If you are truly innocent, if the spirits favor your cause, you will survive. If you are guilty," he let the sentence hang unfinished. Iron's heart sank. He was a decent fighter, but Red Wolf looked like he'd been born with a weapon in his hand. This wasn't going to be a fair fight. It was going to be an execution with extra steps. But before Iron could respond, Swift Arrow did something that surprised everyone. The boy stepped between Iron and Red Wolf and began speaking in rapid, passionate Apache. His young voice carried across the silent gathering, and Iron could see the effect his words were having on the assembled warriors. Crowfeather translated quietly for Iron's benefit. "My son is challenging Red Wolf's accusations. He is telling the warriors exactly what happened. How the soldiers captured him, how they tied him up and beat him when he tried to escape, how he finally managed to get away in the night. He is describing the rope burns on his wrists, the bruises on his face from soldier boots." Swift Arrow continued speaking, his voice growing stronger and more confident. Several warriors were nodding along with his words, and Iron could see Red Wolf's expression beginning to change from certainty to doubt. Now he is telling them about finding Iron Morrison's ranch. Crowfeather continued translating, about how Iron could have shot him on sight, as many white men would have done. Instead, Iron lowered his weapons, offered food and water, tended his injuries like a father would tend his own child. The boy was building towards something. Iron could sense it. His voice was taking on the rhythmic cadence of formal Apache oratory, and even warriors who had seemed hostile were now listening with respectful attention. "He is invoking the law of sacred obligation," Crowfeather explained, and for the first time, Iron heard genuine surprise in the chief's voice. "In our culture, when someone saves your life, you become bound to them by spiritual ties that cannot be broken. My son is declaring that Iron Morrison is now under the protection of our family honor." Red Wolf's face had gone dark with anger, but Iron could see that the young war leader was trapped by Apache law and custom. If Swift Arrow had formally invoked the sacred obligation, challenging Iron would be the same as challenging the chief's family directly. But Red Wolf wasn't finished fighting. "The boy is brave, and his words carry weight. But there is still the matter of the soldiers who took him. They are still out there, still a threat to our people. If this Iron Morrison truly wishes to prove his honor, let him help us deal with the soldiers who dared to lay hands on the son of Crowfeather." Iron felt his stomach drop. This was a test he couldn't possibly pass. Help Apache warriors fight U.S. cavalry. That would make him a traitor to his own people. But refuse, and he'd be proving that his loyalty lay with the soldiers who had tortured a child. Crowfeather was watching Iron's face carefully, clearly understanding the impossible position the homesteader had been placed in. "Red Wolf speaks of a difficult choice. In helping us, you would be acting against your own people. But in refusing to help us, you would be protecting those who showed no mercy to an innocent child." Iron looked at Swift Arrow, seeing the hope and trust in the boy's eyes. He thought about the rope burns on those small wrists, the bruises from soldier boots, the fear and pain the child had endured. Then he thought about his oath as a former cavalry soldier, his duty to his country and his people. Finally, he spoke. "Chief Crowfeather, I won't help you fight American soldiers, but I will do something else." Iron paused, knowing that his next words would either save his life or seal his doom. "I'll go with you to the cavalry camp, and I'll testify to what I saw. I'll tell them that they had no right to torture a child, no matter what their military objectives were. I'll make sure they face justice under American law." The silence that followed was absolute. 150 warriors sat motionless, waiting to see how their leaders would respond to this unprecedented offer. Iron was proposing something that had never been tried before, using the white man's law to seek justice for Apache wrongs. Red Wolf spoke first. "You would testify against your own soldiers?" "I'd testify against anyone who tortures children," Iron replied firmly. "Soldier or civilian, white or Apache, what they did to Swift Arrow was wrong and they should answer for it." Crowfeather and Red Wolf exchanged a long look, carrying on a silent conversation that Iron couldn't interpret. Finally, Crowfeather nodded slowly. "This is unusual, but perhaps unusual times call for unusual solutions." What none of them knew was that Captain Weatherby and his patrol were approaching Iron's ranch at that very moment, having finally tracked Swift Arrow's trail to its end. When they topped the ridge overlooking the valley, Weatherby saw something that made his blood run cold: 150 Apache warriors surrounding a small homestead. "Sir," his sergeant whispered, "should we ride for reinforcements?" Weatherby studied the scene through his field glasses, his mind racing through options. He had 30 men against 150. Charging would be suicide. Retreating would mean abandoning any chance of recapturing his prisoner. But there was a third option, one that appealed to Weatherby's twisted sense of tactics. "Sergeant, prepare the mountain howitzer," he ordered quietly. "We're going to send those savages a message they won't forget." Down in the valley, Iron was still negotiating the terms of his offer when a new sound cut through the evening air. A whistle, growing louder, followed by an explosion that shook the ground and sent dirt and rocks flying just 50 yards from where the Apache leaders were standing. Every warrior instantly had a weapon in hand, but Crowfeather raised his hand for calm. "Cavalry, on the ridge, they have a cannon." Iron looked up at the ridgeline and saw the blue uniforms of U.S. soldiers. At the center of their line, the distinctive silhouette of a mountain howitzer was being reloaded for another shot. Captain Weatherby's voice carried clearly across the valley, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "This is Captain Marcus Weatherby of the 6th Cavalry. You are harboring a prisoner of the United States Army. Surrender the Apache boy immediately, or we will open fire." Iron felt the situation spiraling completely out of control. Two armed forces facing each other across his ranch, with him and Swift Arrow caught in the middle. One wrong move, one miscommunication, and this valley would become a battleground that would make headlines across the country. But it was Swift Arrow who provided the solution. The boy walked forward, positioning himself where both forces could see him clearly, and shouted back at the soldiers in perfect English, "I am Swift Arrow, son of Victorio Crowfeather. I was not captured by this man. I was rescued by him. The soldiers on that ridge beat me and tied me up like an animal. Iron Morrison saved my life." The effect of Swift Arrow's words was immediate and dramatic. Several of the Apache warriors began shouting in their own language, clearly angry at this confirmation of their worst suspicions about military treatment of their people. On the ridge, Iron could see confusion spreading through the cavalry ranks as they processed what the boy had said. Captain Weatherby's response was swift and brutal. "The prisoner is obviously under duress. All units prepare to fire. We will not allow Apache propaganda to—" He never finished the sentence. Red Wolf, who had been holding a notched arrow throughout the entire confrontation, released his shot with precision that spoke of years of training. The arrow took Weatherby in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. What followed was 3 seconds of perfect silence, as if the entire universe was holding its breath. Then both sides exploded into violence. The Apache warriors charged up the slope with war cries that could be heard for miles. The soldiers opened fire with their rifles and began frantically trying to reload the howitzer. And in the middle of it all, Iron Morrison found himself making a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could have taken cover in his cabin, could have waited for the battle to end, and hoped that the winning side would remember his neutrality. Instead, he ran toward the fighting, toward the chaos and violence, and almost certain death. Because Swift Arrow, brave and defiant as he was, had positioned himself directly in the line of fire between two armies that were now trying to kill each other. Iron reached the boy just as bullets and arrows began flying in both directions. He tackled Swift Arrow to the ground behind a large boulder and covered the child's body with his own, feeling the wind from near misses ruffling his hair. "Why?" Swift Arrow shouted over the noise of gunfire. "Why do you risk yourself for me again?" Iron's answer came without hesitation. "Because that's what you do for family." The battle raged for 15 minutes that felt like hours. When the smoke finally cleared, 12 soldiers were dead, including Captain Weatherby, and 6 Apache warriors had fallen. The remaining cavalry troops were in full retreat, abandoning their howitzer and fleeing toward the nearest fort. Chief Crowfeather approached the boulder where Iron and Swift Arrow had taken shelter. His war paint was smeared with dust and sweat, and there was blood on his tomahawk, but his eyes were calm. "Iron Morrison," he said formally, "you have twice now risked your life for my son, once in peace and once in war. By Apache law, you are no longer just a white man living in our territory. You are family." Iron helped Swift Arrow to his feet, checking to make sure the boy hadn't been injured in the crossfire. "What does that mean exactly?" Crowfeather smiled for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "It means that your ranch is under the protection of the Chiricahua Apache. It means that you will always have safe passage through our lands, and it means that if you ever need help, you have 150 warriors who will answer your call." Red Wolf approached, having overheard the conversation. "I questioned your honor, Iron Morrison. I was wrong. You have proven yourself in the way that matters most, by standing with us when it would have been easier to stand against us." In the days that followed, Iron's ranch became something unprecedented in Arizona territory, a neutral ground where Apache and white settlers could meet safely. The territorial governor, faced with the political nightmare of explaining why U.S. troops had been torturing Apache children, was more than willing to overlook Iron's role in the battle in exchange for his help in establishing peaceful relations with Crow Feather's band. Swift Arrow recovered quickly from his injuries, but he spent several more weeks at Iron's ranch before returning to his people. During that time, he taught Iron to speak Apache, while Iron taught him advanced English and basic reading. More importantly, they forged a friendship that would last for decades. Years later, when Swift Arrow had grown into a respected leader in his own right, he would often bring his own children to visit Uncle Iron, telling them stories about the white man who had risked everything to save an Apache boy's life. And Iron, who never married but never lived alone, became something unique in the American West, a bridge between two worlds that had seemed destined for eternal conflict. The mountain howitzer, abandoned by Weatherby's retreating troops, remained on Iron's property for the rest of his life, a rusted reminder of the day when choosing to feed a hungry child had prevented a war. Iron never moved it, and neither did the Apache. It became a monument to the idea that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is show kindness to someone different from themselves. Iron Morrison lived to be 81 years old, dying peacefully in 1924, surrounded by friends from both cultures who had learned that courage comes in many forms. His ranch continued to serve as neutral ground long after his death, and today visitors can still see the old homestead, the rusted cannon, and the grave marker that reads simply, Ezekiel Iron Morrison, father to all who needed one. Swift Arrow, who eventually became known as Chief Swift Arrow the Peacemaker, lived until 1943, spending his final years working with the federal government to establish fair treaties with southwestern tribes. His own grave marker placed next to Iron's at the old ranch bears an inscription in both English and Apache, brothers in spirit, divided by birth, united by choice. If you're fascinated by these incredible true stories of courage and friendship from the American frontier, make sure to subscribe to Westbound Epic Stories, because we have dozens more tales of heroes who chose compassion over conflict and legends who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is an open heart. Click that subscribe button now, and click the video on your screen to discover another story so incredible, you'll question whether it could really be true. Spoiler alert, it is, and it's even more amazing than this one.